So welcome to everyone, and we are really delighted, and I'm personally extremely happy and honored to have Peter Rosset speaking to all of us this evening. And we have changed the regular timing to, so that people from different parts of the world can join this webinar conveniently. If I can think of one person who's been part of the agroecology movement, various facets of it, right from theory to practice to policies, it would be Peter Rosset. So, and we have followed his work to a large extent, reading various materials, and therefore it gives me great personal happiness to welcome him as the speaker for today's webinar. Peter has been part of Via Campesina, the largest transnational movement around the world today. And he's been working with them for a very long time. He'll tell us a lot about it and various aspects of agroecology, I'm sure. And he is a professor and researcher in the academic group on agroecology at Ecosur, Advanced Studies Institute in Chiapas in Mexico. He's a visiting professor in the sociology graduate program of the State University of Sierra in Brazil and at the Social Research Institute of Chulalongkorn University in Bangkok, Thailand. And that's where he's going to be speaking to us from. He recently retired after being a long-time staff of the International Secretariat of Via Campesina. And those of you who know his work know he's authored many books. And the most recent one, which he co-authored, is Agroecology, Science and Politics. So over to you, Peter, and welcome everyone, and request you to please mute yourselves. Thanks, Peter.
Thank you so much for the introduction and the invitation. Thank you so much to both of you. It's really an honor to share with this particular online community our experiences with agroecology in Via Campesina. And I hope that this will be interesting for everybody. So I'm normally based in Mexico, though I spend a substantial amount of time in Brazil, and now currently I'm a short-term visiting professor here in Bangkok at Chulalongkorn University. But most importantly, I recently retired from Via Campesina International, where for more than a decade I had the great honor and opportunity to accompany processes of agroecology at the international level. And this is what I'd like to talk about. For those of you who are not so familiar with Via Campesina, it's possibly after the largest religions, it's the next largest and biggest secular movement of human beings on planet Earth, possibly speaking for some 200,000 rural families in 80 countries in the world, in Asia, Africa, America, Europe, the Middle East. It's composed of mostly national, but not exclusively national organizations from all of those countries. So the members are not individual families, but are organizations. And it came about because peasant organizations around the world, not just peasants, but also indigenous people, landless people, farm workers, other peoples who live in rural areas, rural youth, rural women, in their local and national struggles, maybe 25 to 30 years ago, came to the realization that many of the problems and threats that rural areas face around the world, both rural people and Mother Earth in rural areas, are not threats whose origin is necessarily inside national borders. So yes, they have struggle against large landholders, against big industries at the national level, against politicians, political parties, aspects of government in different countries. But often those situations are determined at a global level from locations like the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the World Trade Organization, Washington, Brussels, etc. And so they realized that they had to add an additional level of struggle to their local struggles and their national struggles, a struggle at the international level to defend rural life. And that's how Via Campesina came about some 25, 30 years ago, as farmer leaders from all of these continents and countries realized that they needed to join together because many of the enemies of peasants and small farmers and indigenous people are the same around the world, and the threats that they face are very similar. And we're even talking about the threats that peasants and small farmers face in Asia, in Latin America, in Africa, are often, it's hard to believe, but are often similar threats to those faced by family farmers in Europe, Japan, the United States. And so that was the basis of coming together. And one of the important things in Via Campesina is that it's the largest space for exchanging knowledge and allowing farmer and peasant leaders from around the world to share their reading of the evolving reality, the policy environment, the initiatives of multinational corporations, the military inventions of imperialist countries. How is that scenario evolving, and what does that mean? And what's Monsanto doing? What's the WTO doing? And be able to understand that, put the jigsaw together at the global level and create joint plans for struggle, for defending territories, for training their members, for example, in agroecology. What I've shown in this series of images, which in this case come from Latin America, are what we could call two major axes of work of Via Campesina. The upper level would be the political struggle, the struggle against bad policies from bad governments, the struggle in favor of agrarian reform, the struggle against the World Trade Organization, against World Bank policies, against transnational corporations, and on the lower level, the internal work to transform conditions from the plot that's being farmed to the community and territorial level, recovering peasant seeds, recovering knowledge, recovering the soil, building agroecology processes. And although these particular pictures are from Latin America, as I said, Via Campesina is global, and we can see that wherever we go, we're going to find large mobilizations and large organizations that are part of this global movement. Now, this global movement has prioritized agroecology as one of the tools being used to transform reality in rural areas, improve conditions, and better live in harmony with nature and Mother Earth. So Via Campesina feels that peasant and family farm-based agroecology has many advantages compared to industrial agriculture and to everything that was imposed on rural areas through the Green Revolution. Agroecology can help us produce healthy food for local people as part of food sovereignty, can help strengthen and recover rural livelihoods and rural cultures, can increase resilience to climate change and other external shocks, can lower greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture, can lower production costs for producing families and therefore lead to less indebtedness by peasant families and family farmers, allows us to have better stewardship of the land and other productive resources of biodiversity, and in particular helps build greater autonomy for peasant communities and families, autonomy from the global market, autonomy from bad government policies, autonomy from having to buy inputs like chemical pesticide and chemical fertilizer and depend on those input markets. So, and many other things, but there are many advantages all of which come together in leading Via Campesina to prioritize. And perhaps the biggest one is that agroecology is seen as a key pillar in the construction of food sovereignty. Food sovereignty is the banner, the global banner of struggle of La Via Campesina. Food sovereignty means that every nation, every people, every territory should largely produce the food that is consumed. It should be produced by local family and peasant farmers, indigenous people. It should be culturally appropriate. It should be agroecologically produced, not produced with poisonous chemicals. It should use local seeds. Many times it requires agrarian reform in order for families to have land, or certainly requires defending the land and territory that they already have from land grabbers. And it also depends on defending national economies from dumping and unfair trade practices, and that means no to free trade agreements. It means agriculture out of the World Trade Organization, the World Trade Organization out of agriculture. So food sovereignty is the overall banner of struggle of La Via Campesina, and agroecology is a key part. Now it's important that we think about where agroecology comes from, and we could say if agroecology is related to farming without chemicals, without chemical fertilizer, without pesticide, then that's something that our ancestors were doing for thousands of years, for millennia. And so at the most basic level, agroecology comes from the knowledge and practices of smallholder peasant farmers that have been accumulated over thousands of years and passed from generation to generation. It's only been in the last 75 years that farm chemicals have been available. And before that, people always produced their food, and they always produced it without using those things that didn't even exist. So we have this accumulated knowledge, and then more recently, in what we might call the science of agroecology, we've had a dialogue amongst different kinds of knowledge. So we have this accumulated peasant knowledge, and then to a certain extent, that's been written down or systematized by dialogue between wise peasants and Western sciences like ecology, agronomy, rural sociology, etc. But beyond all of this stuff in the human sphere, nature is the model for agroecology. So when we farm ecologically, we try to emulate and coexist with nature, with natural ecosystem processes, instead of farming against nature, which is what industrial agriculture does. Industrial agriculture eliminates all biodiversity, levels the land, plants monoculture as far as the eye can see, and homogenizes everything and destroys nature, pollutes water, destroys the soil, destroys the biology in the soil, destroys the biodiversity. Whereas agroecology attempts to recover that biodiversity, to have complex mixed cropping systems, agroforestry, and animals, use natural processes instead of external inputs. So when I say that it comes from accumulated peasant knowledge over centuries or millennia, it's important for people who live in the cities who may share some common urban prejudices or biases that rural people are somehow uneducated or less intelligent, which is completely false. It's really important to have some kind of a minimal idea of how complex and valuable farmer knowledge is. So when somebody is plowing with a team of animals, what are all of the complex kinds of information and knowledge and advanced processes of integration that's going through, that's being processed by a peasant farmer about weather patterns, soil quality, pest movement, market prices, ecological processes, animal behavior, culinary preferences, landscape level processes. All kinds of knowledge is being integrated constantly. And I would just challenge any urban person to just try to imagine how they could possibly get a grasp on that, yet the world's peasant farmers are able to manage and integrate all of that really complex knowledge and information in a very effective way, and have done so for thousands of years or for millennia. A key characteristic of agroecology is that it means the application of principles and not recipes. What does that mean? What that means is that if you think about conventional agricultural extension, where you have either pesticide salesmen or government extension agents, they're going to come and recommend the same thing, like on a recipe basis, over thousands of hectares. They're going to say, plant this monoculture, buy this commercial seed, apply this brand of chemical pesticide, apply this formula chemical fertilizer without any regard to variations in local reality, the slope of the soil fertility, water availability, rainfall patterns, local biodiversity, pest presence. None of that's going to be taken into account in conventional industrial agriculture. On the other hand, agroecology is not a recipe basis like that. It's not a doctor prescribing an antibiotic. It's principles like recycling organic matter in the system and incorporating biomass into the soil. So for example, if you live next door to a rice processing plant, the way you get biomass into the soil might be getting surplus rice husks from the rice processing plant and plowing them into your soil. But if you don't happen to live next to a rice processing plant, but you happen to have some native cows, you may use their manure and their urine to make biological formulations that you can apply to your soil or to your crop foliage to provide fertility. Or if you don't have a cow, you may plant green manure seeds of leguminous plants. So there are many different ways that a particular principle will be materialized, and that's going to depend on every unique local reality. And that requires that complex farmer and peasant knowledge that we saw before. Without that knowledge of what's possible and what makes sense, there's no way to figure out how to apply principles in accordance with everything that varies from one reality to another. Some of these principles on the more biological technical side promote the recycling of biomass, balance nutrient flows, always work to secure favorable soil conditions. That means always keep as much organic matter in the soil as possible, stimulate soil biology. Industrial agriculture has a dead soil. That's why they have to put in chemicals to provide fertility. But agroecological farming means having a living soil, and a living soil needs food for soil microbes, that's organic matter, and needs taking care of like any living organism. You have to minimize the loss of resources by having a more closed system. Industrial agriculture is an open system, inputs in, products out. An agroecological system is a closed system where things are recycled and cycle around. We always try to maximize diversity, species and genetic diversity at the field level. We also try to have diversity at the landscape level and enhance biological interactions and synergisms. Instead of using inputs that are purchased, agroecology creates interactions. So for example, and synergisms. For example, instead of buying a chemical fertilizer, we may use an intercropping system where one plant repels the pests of the other. So it's a biological interaction rather than a purchased input that's managing insect pests, for example. And then social organization and process. And this is where grassroots social movements and peasant organizations, indigenous peoples organizations, community organizations really come in, because there is no way for agroecology to spread or multiply without social organization and social processes. I'm going to come back to that in a moment, but before I come back to that, I'd like to say that we're in a particular moment for agroecology where, after having been ignored or ridiculed for decades by the establishment and by institutions and by the private sector, suddenly everybody has discovered agroecology. FAO from the United Nations says it's necessary to fight hunger and climate change. Multinational corporations want to say that they're agroecological so they can greenwash their image. If you go to the websites of many of the large pesticide and GMO companies today, you'll discover that they're agroecological. Of course they're not, but they're trying to claim that they are. So are we fighting for that agroecology that Monsanto, for example, or Bayer might be putting forth, where they're saying it's still going to be a monoculture, but we're going to do something non-chemical in it? Or are we talking about the complex agroecological peasant and family farm agroecology that social movements like Via Campesina are defending and building? So we're clear that we don't want the agroecology of institutions. We want peasant agroecology. We want this recovery and use of this complex peasant knowledge. We have a major challenge. We realize that agroecology is better. We want to do it, but how do we bring it to scale? In the sense that the Green Revolution has colonized minds in rural territories. The imposition of exogenous knowledge means that many small farmers in the world are using monoculture and chemicals. So how do we change that? How do we scale peasant agroecology? And by that, we don't mean make it into a small farm into a big farm. No, we mean bringing together many small farms so that we can have agroecology be practiced by ever more families over ever larger territories. This is the challenge, and it means moving agroecology, for example, in social movement, discourse to practice. Now is the time to create peasant agroecological territories in our global dispute with land grabbers, with agribusiness, with mining corporations. So coming back to the social organization, if we want to multiply, amplify, massify peasant agroecology, then we need social organization. Sometimes what social movements in Via Campesina called organicity, the degree to which there's a dense internal social organizational fabric. And it's social organization that's the culture medium on which agroecology can grow and spread through territories. Let me give you a kind of an explanation of why that is. Imagine that I'm a farmer. I and my family are peasant farmers. We have, through hard work and our own knowledge and other learning we've been able to do, managed to transform our farm into a model agroecological farm, an agroecological paradise. But if we don't participate or belong to any kind of an organized space that would identify us as somebody, as people who have something that can be taught to others or that can inspire others, there's no way for us to have a multiplier effect. So maybe our immediate neighbors would find out what we're doing and be interested in it, but there's no systematic way for our example to have any other kind of effect. On the other hand, if we're part of a farmer, peasant, indigenous community organization that has made a conscious decision to intentionally create a social process in which, for example, the organization would self-diagnose and identify the families who have agroecological experiences that could inspire and that other families could learn from, and then organizes exchange where some families visit the other families, then there's a possibility. So we need horizontal social process methodologies. And what we found in Via Campesina through our own self-study process and also through collaboration with academics is that these processes, for them to be successful, have to be led by peasants and their organizations themselves. Peasant protagonism should be the driving force. For example, at Ecosur, we've done a comparison at an international level of some of the big success stories in bringing peasant agroecology to a big scale, and we found that all of them were led by peasants and peasant organizations and not led by external actors like government extension agents or NGOs or academics or government offices. So in taking that into account, the global agroecology process in La Via Campesina is based precisely on horizontal exchanges. While inside a particular organization, those exchanges might be farmer to farmer, family to family, the level of Via Campesina, they will be farmer organization to farmer organization, and includes peasant and farmer agroecology schools, where are concentrated spaces for peasants to teach peasants, farmers to teach farmers, and also do political and organizing training. So as we've looked both in Via Campesina and at the academic level at what were the key factors that allowed success stories to be successful, social organization, social movements, horizontal social process methodology, alternative horizontal pedagogy, farmers teaching farmers, peasant protagonism, farming practices that work. We're not going to be able to multiply agroecology practices if they don't actually work for farmers. We have to have a motivating discourse. So we find that movements that are members of Via Campesina that have managed to get their members inspired to take the risk of transforming how they farm have come up with a discourse that resonates with people at the heartfelt level. Sometimes political opportunities are important, external allies. There are a number of factors, but what Via Campesina tries to synthesize is social organization, horizontal social process methodology, alternative pedagogies, and the protagonism of peasants and their organizations. So I'd like to give some examples of how this kind of collective action that can take place when we're organized, how that can actually change things, including things that may at first seem unchangeable. So for example, there's a global phenomenon that's very worrisome that's called genetic erosion. Genetic erosion means that we're losing seeds for many of our traditional food crops, our traditional vegetables, our traditional grains. We're losing them because the seed industry has been consolidated, is largely owned by a handful of global corporations, and they're not interested in multiplying and selling thousands of local varieties. They're interested in selling just a few varieties that can work in many different areas. And so as they've monopolized trade in seeds, many seeds have disappeared, and farmers can't find where to buy them anymore if they don't save them themselves. So this almost feels like an inevitable process that nobody can stop. But here's an interesting case of the Korean Women Peasants Association, a member of Via Campesina, which organizes peasant women in all of South Korea. Korean cuisine depends a lot on traditional vegetable varieties. And the women in this association were very concerned that they could no longer find seeds for their favorite varieties because of this genetic erosion and corporate concentration process. So they came up with the idea of an internal campaign inside the National Women's Peasant Association, which they called Every Peasant Woman Adopt a Seed, in which every woman who's in the association should choose one variety that she likes very much, but for which she can no longer buy seeds because they're not available. And she will make a commitment to her community, her family, and her organization to grow that variety, not just for her own consumption or family consumption, but for seed, and enough seed so that she can exchange that seed with other women in the association who have adopted other seed varieties. And so because it's a national organization, they're actually able to slow this apparently unstoppable process of genetic erosion. And they're able to slow it or even reverse it because they're organized, because of social organization, and because they created a process, the Every Peasant Woman Adopt a Seed process. Something that they're very proud of, that's very successful. So successful, in fact, that all of La Via Campesina has been inspired, and La Via Campesina has now launched a global process where every peasant family in the world, according to this campaign, should adopt a seed and make the same kind of a commitment to multiply it. We do lots of exchanges, exchange with the Philippine peasant organization that does organic rice, with very small scale agroecological farmers in Sri Lanka, where peasants from all over Asia visited to learn about experiences there. I believe that was Subhash Palekar who participated. Yes, it was in that particular exchange. We have some very important and inspirational success stories. This is Zimbabwe, which brings together in a very unique way agrarian reform and agroecology, two key pillars of the food sovereignty that Via Campesina is struggling to build all around the world. Just a micro history of Zimbabwe is that in the year 2000, the government launched an agrarian reform process because prior to that, a tiny minority of white commercial farmers owned almost all of the farmland, and the vast majority of the peasantry, who are Black African farmers, were landless. And after years of pressure and struggle, they finally got the government to implement an agrarian reform, expropriate land from the large white commercial farmers, give it to the landless Black farmers. But then Great Britain and the United States led the international financial system to blockade Zimbabwe for 13 years so that the country could not do hardly any financial transactions, couldn't import food, couldn't import seeds, couldn't import fertilizer. And luckily, one of the Via Campesina organizations in Zimbabwe, ZIMSOF, was building a very important grassroots agroecological process. And you can see below and to the left, Elizabeth M. Pofu, who is currently the global coordinator of La Via Campesina with her late husband in front of their former home. And she was an agroecological promoter and also led a local land occupation that was then formalized through the agrarian reform. And Zimbabwe was able to survive this economic blockade essentially because of agrarian reform and because of agroecology. We do these exchanges all around the world. This was an exchange in English-speaking Africa between agroecology processes in different areas of the continent, where we had these words of wisdom from a local traditional chief who told us that the problem with people today is that they want to plant fast, eat fast, and then of course they die fast. And we really see this now with COVID, where the comorbidity factors are many health issues created by the bad food produced by industrial agriculture, diabetes, obesity, heart disease. These are all COVID cofactors that lead to higher lethality for people who've had bad diets. So it turns out that he is also a lead agroecological farmer who receives visits from many other farmers around the territory to learn about his agroecological processes. In Latin America, we've had many exchanges at the international level where peasant organizations from some countries learn from peasant organizations in other countries. This was a particular exchange that we had in Guatemala in 2012. Guatemala is very important in the global agroecology movement inside La Via Campesina, because it was in Guatemala in the 1970s where indigenous peasant farmers, Mayan farmers, and this elderly gentleman was one of them in the 1970s, he was of course younger then, took the traditional peasant practice of sharing with neighbors and created a formal methodology called campesino to campesino, which is Spanish for peasant to peasant, in which peasants would teach peasants their agroecological practices and therefore spread agroecology through territories. So this particular methodology has proven over the last 45 years to be one of the most successful social process methodologies for multiplying peasant agroecology. So when we brought together agroecology promoters and facilitators from Via Campesina movements from all over Latin America in Guatemala, we of course had to make a pilgrimage to one of the original agroecological farms where this campesino to campesino process and methodology started. It's kind of a sad story because they developed this methodology in the 1970s, right before the period of time known as the violence, where basically the military dictatorship unleashed the military against indigenous peasant communities. And wherever indigenous peasants were organized, they were considered to be subversives, communists, and targeted for assassination. So he had 4 sons. 3 of his sons were murdered by the military in the first weeks of this war against the communities. His 4th son, who's in the photograph below and to the left, escaped into the mountains where he joined an armed guerrilla movement in the resistance to this military dictatorship. He received training in Vietnam, in North Korea, returned, spent 12 years as the commander of an entire front in this guerrilla warfare. But he told us, this war has been over now for quite some time. He told us that while he was in the forest and in the mountains with the guerrilla army, in fact, his dream and what he went to bed with every night and dreamt about was returning to his father's agroecological farm. So once the war was over, his father, who had fled into exile in Mexico, returned to Guatemala, recovered the farm, which is an agroecological paradise. His son was demobilized, came back, and is now the coordinator of the campesino agroecological process in their territory. And he told us that I am an agroecology promoter today for the same reasons that I had an AK-47 in the armed struggle before, because in both cases, I was defending our indigenous peasant culture and our Mother Earth. Before with a gun, now with agroecology, but the goal is the same. It's to defend rural life, both human life and Mother Earth. That was extremely inspirational, as you can imagine. Here's a global exchange of all of these local peasant seed banks, seed exchange, recovery of traditional seeds processes from around the world. Took place in Bali, Indonesia. We have many such processes around the world inside Via Campesina, and so this was for them to join together and exchange experiences and practices. Now I want to come back to this peasant to peasant or campesino to campesino methodology because it is the antidote or an antidote for what happened in the Green Revolution. The Green Revolution was about imposing external knowledge. It was like an epistemic colonization of the minds of rural people, where know-it-all university-trained agronomists working for government extension agents came and told peasants to abandon their diverse farming practices, their traditional agriculture, that all of that should go out the window, that they should plant commercial monocultures, that they should buy seeds, that they should buy chemicals. And what this knowledge imposition did was to crush a lot of initiative, local protagonism, local knowledge, and local practices of peasants in their territories around the world. Luckily, that process of imposing and crushing and fragmenting and pulverizing knowledge was not complete. So if we go to most peasant communities around the world, even those communities where at first glance it appears that everybody has commercial, modern, in quotes, monocultures, in fact, not all the knowledge was lost. So if you ask people, who still has some of the old seed varieties? They'll say, there's an elderly lady at the end of this particular dirt road who has 20 varieties of some particular crop. Or there's an elderly gentleman in another part of the community who has all the old fruit tree varieties that everybody used to have, but that we all tore down. Or there's a family that still has the traditional livestock species. So in fact, a lot of the knowledge still exists, but it's been dispersed and fragmented. And so one family may have one part of the original knowledge, another family another part, but at the collective community level, the knowledge doesn't exist in a holistic sense. What Campesino to Campesino does is cast a net over that territory to find out where are those pieces of knowledge within the territory, and how can we recover them, exchange them, and bring it back as collective knowledge and not just fragmented knowledge. So it's interesting, while this methodology was developed in Guatemala, Cuba is where it's had its biggest success story, and it's a horizontal kind of knowledge exchange. So instead of that know-it-all agronomist crushing everybody's local knowledge, Campesino a Campesino are exchanges on the farms of local peasant farmers who have something to share with other peasant farmers, men and women, who can learn from them or be at least inspired by their examples. This is a methodology that was introduced to Cuba in the late 1990s through peasant-to-peasant exchanges. The social methodology came, and between about the year 2000 and today, 2020, so that's a little more than 20 years, 50% of all of the peasant families in Cuba have been able to transform their practices into agroecological practices through these horizontal farmer-to-farmer exchanges. Now, I want to give a hypothetical example of how this works. It's a methodology that's implemented by a farmer organization. In the case of Cuba, it's the NAP, which is the National Cuban Small Farmer Association, a member of Via Campesina, who incidentally coordinate agroecology at a global level inside Via Campesina. And they've refined this original methodology. And so they have something that they call an inventory of agroecological practices. So in a given community or municipality or county or territory or cooperative, whatever you want to call it, the farmer organization itself will develop a questionnaire and interview all of the families who are members in that territory and make a list of which families practice which agroecological practices. So for example, in this hypothetical case, the Perez family has incorporation of crop residues into the soil after harvest, has crop rotation, has contour planting. For example, Maria Diaz has incorporation of crop residues, crop rotation, intercropping, living fence posts, contour planting, biological pest repellents, and homeopathic treatment for ticks on her livestock. So we can see she has a total of 7 agroecological practices, and so that would tell the organization, she could be what we call a promoter. That means a peasant farmer who offers workshops on her own farm and where we bring other farmers to learn from her, and we will choose. We also do an inventory of farmers with problems. So for example, we might see that this first farmer here, João Pedro Stedile, has problems with soil pests, leaf-eating pests, livestock ticks, lack of protein for his livestock. He has ticks on his livestock, but didn't we just remember that Maria Diaz, yes, she does successful homeopathic treatment of the ticks on her livestock. And it just so happens that our farmer organization is working with Maria, and she's going to offer a workshop next Sunday on her farm. And everybody who has problems with ticks on their livestock and don't have a solution will be invited. And she's going to teach everybody how she does it, and they can do hands-on learning with her. So on and so forth, the organization is matching all of these agroecological practices with the families who have different problems and organizing these exchanges. So what it's doing is it's taking this fragmented knowledge and it's putting it back together again so that it becomes once again a holistic knowledge at the territory level. And it turns out that most of the particular problems that farmers face in a particular territory, there are already solutions amongst this fragmented knowledge because people have been in that territory for hundreds or thousands of years and have accumulated knowledge. The question is finding it. So this is a systematic process for finding that knowledge and matching those solutions with those problems. One of the lessons then of this Cuban experience, 50% of all of the families in an entire country in 20 years becoming agroecological, strong emphasis on a social process methodology and not just on production techniques. What does that mean? There are many ways to make compost. There are many ways to make biological preparations to enhance fertility. There are many leaves that you can use to make botanical insect pest repellents. There are many alternative forage crops forage plants to provide alternative food for our livestock. There are many options out there. In most territories, they already exist. The problem is that most people don't know about them and aren't using them. So that means that we've done perhaps too much research in agroecology on the best way to make compost and too little research on the best way to organize a process so that everybody can learn about the best way to make compost, which probably doesn't even need to be researched because somebody in the territory already knows how to do it in a way that uses that local resources and that works in local reality. So another item that's part of this social process in the case of Cuba is that they have a peasant agroecology school. It's part of this ANAP organization. They have a process in the territory, which is campesino, and it has farmers who are chosen as promoters, that has members of the organization to facilitate the exchanges, others to coordinate. And so they use their peasant agroecology school to give specific training to those farmers who are going to be teaching on their farm, how to organize a workshop, how to teach what you know to other farmers, on movement facilitators, how to carry out this inventory, how to best organize the exchanges, on coordinators, how do you coordinate this at a provincial level, at a county level. To leaders within the peasant organization itself, because not every peasant leader knows about agroecology or knows about this methodology. To key government officials in the territory. So for example, the mayor of the local village, maybe could actually loan the truck to move of the village to move people to the farmer workshops, if only he or she could be educated about the importance of this agroecology process. So they use the fact that they have a school to do all of these targeted trainings, which synergize their process in the territories. So this leads me to training or formation, as it's often called in Via Campesina. There's lots of processes being created and underway for farmers training farmers in agroecology. Sometimes it's formal training like peasant high schools or peasant universities that give recognized degrees. Sometimes it's open education degrees where we're going to offer classes on compost and anybody can attend them. Sometimes they're peasant training schools that are not formal education. Sometimes they're farmer to farmer processes like Campesino Campesina, which is a school without walls, community and territorial processes. In terms of formal higher education, Latin America is the leader inside Via Campesina, where they've now created peasant universities for the sons and daughters of peasant families who normally don't have access to the university to study agroecology, to study political organizing, regional peasant schools around the world, national peasant agroecology schools. I'll just show you some photographs before I start to close the formal part of my presentation and open for discussion and debate. But this is a peasant university in Paraguay. Paraguay is one of several countries in South America where the indigenous people's language, Guarani, is spoken by many of the peasants in those countries. And so this is a peasant university to train the sons and daughters of Guarani speaking peasant families from Brazil, Paraguay, Uruguay, Argentina, Bolivia, who all have Guarani speaking populations. So peasant university run by peasant organizations. Now, a lot of the training is practical. There's also classroom training. These are peasant agroecology middle schools and high schools in rural communities in Argentina, in the Via Campesina in Argentina. This is our National Peasant Training School in Ecuador. This is the Peasant Agroecology School in Indonesia. Ironically, in Bogor, Bogor is where the largest Green Revolution agronomy faculty is located, basically teaching agronomists to destroy peasant agriculture. And the outskirts, there's the Peasant Agroecology School of Via Campesina, training where peasants train peasants to save and protect peasant agriculture. This is in Karnataka in India, Amrita Bhumi, agroecology or natural farming. Natural farming is another word for agroecology training school. This is the Peasant Center in French-speaking Canada, in Quebec, Canada, which is a school without walls, a Campesino or peasant-to-peasant agroecology school. All of the classes take place on the farms of agroecological peasant farmers. So, to reiterate before I close, both from our social movement self-study experience inside Via Campesina, as well as from academic research, we've highlighted some key factors like social organization, horizontal social process methodology, alternative pedagogy, peasant protagonism, motivating discourse. Many of these things have been brought together or are being brought together in La Via Campesina in this construction of an international, regional, and local agroecology process. I saved India for last, partially because I know that there's some controversy in India, and I didn't really want to get into the controversy, but many of the members of La Via Campesina organizations in India practice zero-budget natural farming, which is also a very has a very large number of families now that have also been able to transform their farming practices. Many of the practices are what we might call traditional or typical agroecology practices, like those that are used in other parts of the world. Very successful training seminar at a Hindu temple. International exchange process where La Via Campesina like we saw in the case of Sri Lanka, in this case in India, or in the case of Guatemala, these exchanges where, or Ghana, I showed photos where Via Campesina will bring farmer organizations from other countries, in this case from all over Asia, where they spent 14 days in Karnataka learning from natural farming practicing peasant farmers there, and brought back inspiration to many of their own countries and stimulated their own processes. It's important to understand, I said at the beginning that agroecology is not principles and is not recipes, it's principles. So what we're trying to do with these exchanges is not that somebody will do an exact copy in their own country. So we're not going to say, go to southern India, learn exactly how it's done there, and then do the same thing in Nepal. Or we're not going to say, go to Cuba, learn how they do it and do it exactly the same way in Venezuela. No, we're trying to expand the inputs for the debate that everybody's having in their own country, in their own organization, on how to create an agroecology process, and seeking inspiration, insights, lessons, principles from the experiences of other organizations in other countries. So with that, I close the formal part of my presentation with the Via Campesina slogan, globalize the struggle, globalize hope, and we could say globalize the agroecology process, globalize food sovereignty. Thank you very much. So I'm going to stop sharing now and open for questions, debate, comments, whatever. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Peter, for a really comprehensive and wide-ranging presentation with global examples from all over the world, not just Latin America. So perhaps I should read out a set of questions first, and then you can respond to them, and then we go on to the others. Is that okay? So Diana says, I have the impression that some farmers value more the green revolution technologies because they've been taught that they are modern. How do you change that mindset? And connected to that, Rajeshwari is also asking, does that also mean, changing the sort of the economic paradigm and so on? So perhaps you could respond to some of those questions first.
Okay, so I was going to go back to the question from Diana. Yes, of course, many farmers value the green revolution technology because that's what they've been taught. And that's this whole problem that I was trying to show with the green revolution as the boot of imposed knowledge coming from outside. So farmers are getting told the same recipes from government extension agents, from the buyers of their produce, from the bank that's giving them credit, from the money lender, from many different sources, are all giving them the same message that's modern and that's what you need to do. And so how do you change that mindset? One way is through future generations. And so Via Campesina organizations have been giving a lot of emphasis towards changing what's taught in local schools in rural areas, so that the implicit message in public school education in peasant communities isn't that you should be ashamed to be a peasant and you should move to the city because that's better, but the message should be that you should be proud to be a peasant. Producing food is the most valuable and important occupation in any current country in the world. And so changing the mindset, starting with the way our children are educated, is one part of it. And then another part has to do with creating this whole process inside the farmer organization with a discourse, with an educational process, with a method, with easy access to knowledge and how to do it differently, with visits to farmers who are farming agroecologically very successfully. So it's the whole process that's designed to break this stranglehold on what people think they should be valuing, and so that people can revalue their own knowledge. Now, the message for new economics, definitely this whole idea of the economics of linking peasant farmers into value chains of agribusiness, where they should buy very expensive inputs based on bank credit, where they get deeper and deeper into debt and then sell under contract for ever lower prices and eventually lose their land, many times committing suicide. That's bad economics for peasants. And absolutely, we need to create relative autonomy from these global international agribusiness markets, recover local economies, recover community markets, markets in local towns, peasant markets, farmers markets, agroecological market. So definitely new economics is a very big and important part of it.
Thanks for your presentation. It's always inspirational to hear about La Via Campesina. It's been so for the last 2 decades and more, for so many reasons and all the reasons that you gave. But one of the most fascinating things I have been trying to kind of get my head around is how does such a large organization spread over so many countries? How does it manage to maintain its fundamental ethics both of how we relate to the external world and also how the internal organization works in terms of hierarchies or horizontal working and so on? And one of the reasons I'm asking is because I remember 3 years back or so, I was in Ecuador and I was down in Nabon County, and there the farmers were saying that, maybe it was 4 years back, that the Rafael Correa government was bearing down with its own imposition of its own agriculture model, which was very heavily industrialized, etc. But the Via Campesina organization in Ecuador, because it was aligned with that government, was creating problems for the locally diverse agroecological movements. And so I presume this kind of thing must be happening every once in a while, probably not common, but every once in a while. And how does the organization deal with something like this?
Well, first, La Via Campesina is composed of organizations that are composed of human beings, and we're very complicated in general. And wherever we're to be found, we generally create problems. So I certainly wouldn't want to claim that Via Campesina is free from that general tendency of humanity. But the idea, of course, is to create structures that would not favor those problems. And so I would say on the side of the secrets to success, why Via Campesina, although it has problems like that, hasn't succumbed to them as a movement, would some of the key factors, I think, are having collective and rotating leadership. And so that means that it's not going to be one person forever, but it's going to be more than one person, a collective. It's going to be balanced. So, for example, the global coordinating body is re-elected every 4 years. It's composed of a man, a woman, and a youth from every one of 9 regions in the world. So that's 27 people. And so no individual is making decisions. Another important thing is that the direction of the movement should be set by the peasant leadership and not by the technical staff. So while I was a technical staff, I wasn't setting direction for the movement, but was helping to implement the direction set by the peasant leadership. Another key factor was the decision quite some years ago now that women should have at least 50% representation in all spaces of debate, discussion, planning, decision-making, public voice, etc., in the movement. And so I think that's very important. Now, the case of Ecuador is interesting because it illustrates a sad fact that's happened across Latin America with all of these progressive governments that we were all very excited about when they first came to power. Most of them are out of power now. And but the disappointment with them by peasant organizations had set in in many cases before they were out of power. And that's precisely for the reasons that you gave. So, for example, that organization in Ecuador eventually came around to having a very negative evaluation of the government's agriculture policy. Actually, first they started fighting with them when the government tried to privatize water. So that was like the first break. But of course, they were aligned with them in the beginning because it really seemed like this was going to be the real change. But when it ended up that even though there was a progressive discourse, a lot of the practice was still neoliberal, then they began to have conflicts with different issues. Water privatization was one, not supporting agroecology was another. And so it eventually escalated. I don't want to get too much into the dirty laundry details, but the government took reprisals against that organization. They eventually ended up breaking up the organization. And it was more than a sad comment on peasant organizations, because the peasant organization actually came around to a more balanced analysis of what was going on. It was a sad comment on how politicians behave. And even when they have a progressive discourse, they often have a neoliberal practice. And so that would be kind of my response to that very important issue that you raised.
Peter, I had a couple of questions. One had to do with, I think you partly responded to it. One has to do with really the role of the state and in La Via Campesina. And also, I'm sure since it's a transnational movement, it's been varied and across the world, we probably have different experiences. I'd like to hear a little bit about that. The second question is that, of course, we all know, that agribusiness like Monsanto and others who are talking about agroecology and not using GM or pesticide-free crops and all that, they are a threat. But what is your view on really the larger challenges that agroecology faces in this day and times?
Well, I think that the issue of the state is a complex one, and as you alluded to, since Via Campesina is in 80 countries, that means Via Campesina is sampling the behavior of a lot of different states, and so and that would mean a very few good ones, a lot of bad ones, and a lot of really ugly ones, by and large. And there are these occasional moments where new governments give hope. However, in my now 25-year experience with it, I'm now going to depart from Via Campesina and just say, me, Peter Rosset, having accompanied by Via Campesina, but not speaking on behalf of Via Campesina, what is my perception? And my perception is that with very, very, very few exceptions that you can count on less than the fingers of one hand, the state in general is not going to be the friend of peasants, and is not going to be the friend of agroecology. So, we can take advantage of differences of opinion because the state's not monolithic. We may find some allies in government agencies. We might find a few parliamentarians. We may very occasionally get a helpful law passed or a helpful subsidy in some country, but that's going to be the exception. And as we've seen with the pandemic, almost all states around the world abandoned peasants, abandoned rural areas during the pandemic. All of the health measures were concentrated on urban areas, and the economic relief measures, those countries that actually had them pretty much only had them for urban people. So I think I'm personally coming around to the view that we shouldn't have too much hope in the state. Of course, we need to fight at that level, like get Trump out of power or whatever, but to actually feel that the salvation is going to come from the state, I think that at least I'm past that. I perhaps used to believe that at some point in the distant past, but I believe that agroecology helps build something that's very important, which is some space of at least relative autonomy for rural people in their communities, in their territories, where they can control a space where they can decide what's going to be grown, how it's going to be grown, what kind of a local economy they're going to have, what kind of a local healthcare system they're going to have, how are their children going to be taught, with what pedagogical methods, with what content. And so I see this issue of autonomy, not autonomy in the sense of one part of a country ceding, like Kashmir or something like that. That's a political issue. What I'm talking about is peasant territorial autonomy, not necessarily as an absolute process, though we have interesting absolute processes like the Zapatistas in Mexico, where I live, but at least as a relative process where instead of hoping the state's going to resolve it, we try to take as much control as we can on an organized collective community organizational basis of our own environment, of our own territory, making our own decisions and creating our own collective processes. So I've come around to that view over time, and agroecology is going to be no different. Of course, we can try to get some helpful policies from the state, but we really need to focus on building our own peasant agroecology schools, on creating our own territorial farmer-to-farmer, community-to-community processes. So in terms of the challenges, I think one of the biggest challenges facing the peasant movement right now is precisely rethinking our relationship as people's organizations to political parties, electoral processes, governments, the state, and perhaps trying to think how we can take more control over our own lives and our own territories. That's one of the biggest challenges. How do we break the dependence on external experts, on external money, on external funding agencies, on external actors, and how do we do things for ourselves and create and transform our own realities. And I think that's kind of where the challenge has come around to. Once again, I'm not saying to ignore the state. I'm not saying we shouldn't fight over who's governing the state, whether it's a fascist or not. But that's not a substitute for building processes to take control of our own lives and our own territories. Over.
There is a question here from Zoe Mansata, who says that, is patenting of traditional agroecological knowledge and practices, is this compatible with the larger goals related to agroecology and
Definitely not. Definitely patenting or any kind of privatization of knowledge runs counter to everything that we're trying to do. Once knowledge is patented, then it's being appropriated for private, individual, or corporate benefit. And so Via Campesina is against all patenting of seeds, all patenting of knowledge. And for example, with peasant seeds, there was a long debate in Via Campesina, the final conclusion of which is that seeds are a heritage of rural communities, of rural peoples. But it's our heritage, but a heritage that we put at the service of humanity free of charge, without patents, without licensing, on a solidarity basis. Not putting it at the service of Monsanto or Syngenta or Bayer or ChemChina, but putting at the service of other peasant communities on a horizontal solidarity basis. And so that's for seeds, but the same would go to any kind of knowledge on agroecological practices. We're absolutely against any kind of patenting or any other kind of privatization of knowledge.
Let me combine a question that Chelsea Klinker has and with a question of my own. So she says, how can we draw upon rural community-based agroecological models in urban food production and to work towards food sovereignty? And my question is not exactly related, but it has to do with something that you brought up around this question of organization, around making sure that there's markets, there's downstream integration with markets and so on. And yet at the same time, you don't seem very thrilled about extension workers and that sort of support coming from the government to these processes. And yet there seems to be at least a midway solution offered by some governments, like the food producer organization model. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that. It's the food, so the FPOs or FPCs as they're called. These are not quite cooperatives, but they are organized, they're farmer groups that are organized somewhat hierarchically, but help build linkages upstream and downstream. And of course, they're mostly used with conventional farming, but there are also some interesting experiments with non-conventional natural farming and so on, particularly in Andhra Pradesh, which you've written about and so on. So the question would be, to draw on both of these, are there ways in which this kind of community building effort and scale questions, can they take place across contexts? For instance, urban gardening and community gardening integrated with these. And do these kinds of government incentives, if not government support for organizational forms, can these help in these types of ventures?
So on the first question around urban areas and agroecology in urban areas, I think that often when people think about urban agriculture, they are mistakenly focusing on what's actually a minority of urban agriculture, which would be something like middle-class people trying to have raised beds in their backyard or something like that. I think that a key starting point is to realize that this exodus from rural areas that's been driven by land grabbing and agribusiness over the last century, where have those people gone? Over the last 50 years, the proportion of humanity that are rural people and that are peasants for the first time in human history has dropped below 50%. I think now peasants and rural people are somewhere around 42% of humanity. All throughout history, before that, they were 80% or more of humanity. So where have all those people gone? They've gone to fuel the fastest growing demographic category of human population over the last half century, which are urban slums. And so maybe we have 20 to 30% of the world's population are now living in urban slums. And that population is almost entirely peasants who are displaced from the countryside. So if you go to urban slums anywhere in the world, the people who live there are peasants driven out of rural areas, or sons and daughters of peasants, or grandchildren of peasants, or nieces and nephews of peasants. And almost all of them have extended family that are still in the village in rural areas, and they have brought a lot of peasant culture and peasant practices to urban areas. And so you'll find that they have animals in their backyard, fruit trees, vegetable garden, or if they don't even have a backyard, plants, medicinal plants and herbs growing in the window, sometimes animals even being raised inside the house. So there's a huge amount, the largest amount of urban agriculture is actually being carried out by what I call the peasants in the city. And if we add together the peasants in the country and the peasants in the city, we're talking about 70 to 80% of humanity with a lot of peasant knowledge and with access to a lot of peasant knowledge. So why is it that some people are just so good at raising food in the city? It's often because they brought that peasant culture with them, either because they personally came or because their parents or their grandparents came, and that knowledge was transmitted in the urban setting just as it was in the rural setting. So based on that, my personal opinion is we can create the same kind of processes that Via Campesina is building in rural areas. For example, in Belo Horizonte, Brazil, I know that there's a guy who came from the landless workers movement who was doing campesino in a rural area, who's now doing it with urban gardeners in the favela slums in Brazil, and with the same kind of rapid success of socializing and sharing these kind of principles. Now, I'm suspicious about farmer or producer organizations that are created by government agencies. I won't say that they never work, but I will say that in my experience, they're a poor substitute for ones that are created by people themselves. So I'm not that familiar with FPCs in India, although I recently read an article about them, but my memory is failing me. But I am very familiar with the current process in Mexico, where the new president has created a process called Planting Life, Sembrando Vida, in rural areas, where the government is paying people every month to plant agroforestry systems. And not only is it paying them, but it's putting them into cooperatives designed by government bureaucrats. And we're doing a research project where we're interviewing people who are participating in this program. And what we've discovered is that these cooperatives don't really exist. There's a government bureaucrat who said that every 100 families who are getting paid every month by the program have to be in a cooperative, and the proof of the cooperative is we need the signature of a president and a vice president. When we actually go to the territory, we hear, oh yeah, the government official came by and said that he needed 2 signatures. But your cooperative? No, what cooperative? They don't even know what's going on. So, I mean, this is like a microcosm of what happens when farmer organizations are created by governments. Of course, there'll be a success story, 1 or 2. Maybe there's a more enlightened government somewhere. But by and large, in my opinion, ones that arise naturally from the grassroots are much more trustworthy and real than ones that are created by bureaucrats in capital cities on a recipe basis and sent out to be then organized by the farmers in order to have access to some government program like a cash transfer or a subsidy or credit or a marketing support. People go through the motions because they didn't come up with it themselves. It's a condition for something that they want, for some money or for some credit. So I'm not a big fan of that. Once again, I won't say it never works, but I'm skeptical.
Thanks, Peter. There is a question from Anjali, who is a PhD student from the University of Edinburgh. And her question is that she says there are feminist scholars who have, of course, argued that small family farms are gendered in nature, and the voice and knowledge of women, they're often not heard. And in India, where segregation around caste and class is so strong that in small farms become quite uneconomic and sites of social marginalization. So how do you respond to these kinds of social problems in the context of villages in countries like India and.
I can't really speak to it in India, but I will say that inside Via Campesina, there are many. Via Campesina is this big organized exchange space where there's a constant dialogue and new things emerge from it. So food sovereignty emerged from it, and one of the more recent emergences from this space is what the articulation of peasant women inside Via Campesina is calling popular peasant feminism. And their popular peasant feminism is that they believe that they should be struggling against patriarchy inside the rural family, inside the peasant household, inside the peasant community, and inside the peasant organization, and inside La Via Campesina. Because, as I said, these organizations are composed of human beings, and so many of the ills of society will be reflected even in progressive social movements. And so there's a struggle from the women's articulation inside Via Campesina, and they have advanced theoretically their vision of feminism, which they state is they differentiate from what they call urban feminism, what they call middle-class feminism, and what they call feminism imposed by international cooperation agencies from the European Union and other northern countries. And they say that those feminisms don't take into account the reality of rural life, of the peasant family. And for example, they don't insist that inside a peasant household, the tasks of a woman and the tasks of a man should be exactly the same. What they say is they should be equally respected, there should be no violence, and women's voice should be heard equally in decision-making. But they differentiate themselves from the way that, for example, urban feminists may want to restructure household relations. And I would also say that they're very linked with the youth articulation in Via Campesina, which we see generational change taking place. And so the traditional family unit, of course, can be a place of gender oppression, but peasant youth are innovating lots of new kinds of family units or non-family units, collective units, where youth are gathering together. We have even a movement of LGBT peasant youth inside Via Campesina, creating collective living arrangements not based on the traditional family model. So what I can say to the question, which is a very important one, is that Via Campesina is a space where new ideas and new struggles arise because people have this ability to discuss very important things with themselves, with each other, and share experiences. And so I think that very exciting changes are going to come both through the generational shift and also through peasant feminism. And so that's what I would leave it with that on a hopeful note.
So Peter, I'm going to do this again. I'm going to try and combine a question or a discussion that's going on here with one of my own.
Please, because I'm not able to read all of the notes while I'm talking, so I'm counting on you.
There's a lot going on. So yeah, so both Ashish and Rajeshri have been talking about this around the question of the nation state. You know, is that standing in the way? Do we need a more of a cosmopolitan vision and so on? And my question is a little more mischievous in the sense that why should the peasant be the unit of interest, especially if we're talking about a large disenfranchised population who could be mostly peri-urban in the sense that they don't have access, they're the precariat who don't have access to land, and do they have a role, is there space for them in the food sovereignty movement as a whole? So,
well, the short answer is yes, there is space. The precariat, some African scholars are also calling it working people. And so from the perspective of the peasant movement, which is only one perspective, from the perspective of the peasant movement, what we see are peasants in the countryside and part of the grand peasant family in the city, and a lot of the urban precariat, we say, are our peasant family members who are living in the city. And so one way to divide the pie is to say peasants in the country and peasants in the city are the majority of humanity. That's a potential political alliance, not a current one, but a potential one that could be activated. But working people could be another one, or precariat, working people in the countryside in solidarity with working people in the city, especially as the pandemic has brought this to a head, the restructuring of capitalism on a global scale that was already underway, but it cemented it with making work ever more precarious, the Uberization of life. Nobody's going to have a real job anymore. If anybody still had one, they certainly won't have one in the future generations. And so these potential alliances of people who are being hurt by these dominant trends, who are already bad off and are likely to be worse off, there's a lot of political work to be done and a lot of alliances to be built. Even within rural areas, Via Campesina was challenged over the years because initially the viewpoint was from farming people, sedentary farmers. But it turns out that if, for example, sedentary farmers, even when they're landless, fight for agrarian reform, have land given to them, then they build fences and then they cut off the routes for nomadic pastoralists to move their livestock from one part of the countryside to another with changing seasons, or they cut off the access of river-dwelling people to the riverbank. And so maybe 15 years ago, Via Campesina was challenged about the fact that sedentary peasant farmers are not the only popular sector that lives in rural territories. There are forest-dwelling people, there are indigenous people, there are fisher folk, there are pastoralists, there are people who live in the local, in these tiny urbanized little villages in rural areas. And when a mining company comes with a concession for the whole area, they're not just going to go for the land of the sedentary peasant farmers, they're going to go for the land of the indigenous people, the forest dwellers, the fisher folk, the river bank people, everybody, the rural towns, everything's going to be destroyed. And so we have to think of a different model to build solidarity at the territorial level amongst all the different peoples who are going to have to live together and create a common front against common enemies. And so we can extend, and that's changed in Via Campesina. The whole discourse on agrarian reform evolved as a result of that dialogue with other popular sectors who live in rural areas. And I think now we're at the point where those dialogues now have to take place with urban people, whether we're going to say there are peasant brethren, where we're going to say they're also working people like we are, whether we're going to say we're all part of the precariat, but we have to do that political work. And so I'll leave it at that to that question.
Thanks, Peter. There's a question from Tashi Murab, who says that the negotiated contract between farmers and the army has been in practice in Ladakh for many decades now. And it has proved to be economically beneficial, but it has also led to a drastic shift from agroecology to very high insane use of chemical fertilizers. And do you have any tips to deal with this?
I don't know about that specific case, but I will say that in general, that falls into the general category that we deal with in Via Campesina, which is government procurement. And so governments, whether it's armies, schools, hospitals, ministries around the world, cafeterias for ministries, there's a lot of government purchasing of food that takes place everywhere in the world. So it's not just the army in Ladakh, it's all kinds of government agencies in every country in the world. They're procuring a lot of food. And so peasant organizations have had a lot of struggle around that. One of the initial levels of struggle is don't just buy it from agribusiness. How about buying it from the peasant cooperatives or peasant communities that live close to whatever government agency it is? And so there are different ways that that's played itself out. An interesting way that it played out in Brazil during the PT governments, but now rolled back by the Bolsonaro government, was a big new government procurement program was created for school lunch programs. And the original instinct of the government was to buy that from agribusiness providers. And then the peasant movement got very organized and pressured a lot and got the government to agree that 30% would have to be by law procured from peasant providers within a certain distance of whatever procuring agency. So that was a first level. But then this issue of agroecological processes, are they going to be hurt or favored by this? And so they were able to get an additional part into the law that they would be paid an extra price if it was agroecologically produced. I don't remember the price premium, but I think it was something like 30% extra. So they were able to force government agencies to procure 30% from peasants. and then to pay 30% more if it was agroecological. And one of the criteria to participate in the program was you have to be organized, for example, in the form of a cooperative or a peasant producer association. So that there were a lot of problems because on the government side, they made it more and more bureaucratic, and they seemed to think that their role was to exclude peasants from selling to it rather than include them. So there are always these kind of issues that come up when you're dealing with the state sector, but it's still kind of on the more positive side of ways to deal with these situations. And so on the one hand, being locked in to produce for a government agency isn't like necessarily a peasant paradise idea. But on the other hand, if we accept that government agencies are going to be procuring an enormous amount of food in every country at all times, then we have to break the agribusiness lock control on that kind of procurement, and it shouldn't be just 30% that they should be required to buy from small farmers and peasants, but it should be an ever increasing amount. And so some of the proposals have been, well, maybe right in the first year, peasants are not organized to have the capacity to provide 100%, but how about a plan over several years to where there'll be incremental increase, and there'll be credit provided and conditions that would enable peasant cooperatives to scale up their production. On the other hand, there's some downsides. And so a lot of peasant co-ops with the PT governments in Brazil scaled up their production for those government contracts. And then the governments were driven out through a coup and then elections. The new government canceled all the contracts. The peasants were stuck with a large amount of produce, no buyer, and they still had to pay all the credit and the massive debts that they got for it. And many peasant cooperative presidents are now in jail under Brazil with Bolsonaro because they've now been accused of malfeasance in these contracts. Because, for example, the contract said for school lunch program in the local school, you're supposed to produce so many carrots, so much rice, and so many tomatoes. But the actual amount varied, and it was maybe a little more carrots, a little bit less tomatoes. The school district was fine with that, but now they're saying that that's fraud because the contract was for a specific amount. So there are risks associated for peasants getting involved in these kind of schemes. But on the other hand, it doesn't seem right that we as peasant organizations should just allow agribusiness to get all of the contracts to supply all of that government procurement. So it's a long, not specific answer, but it's an issue that peasant organizations are grappling with around the world.
There is a question here from Ajit Kumar Jha, and he says, the Indian government has passed 3 laws recently, and which it claims will set up one nation, one market. And the attempt is to set up a national agricultural market where agribusiness corporations will face farmers directly as an alternative to the traditional mandis or markets, peasant markets tied to the local state governments. Now, how can market organizations fight that attempt farmer organizations fight that attempt by the federal government? And what is the experience from Latin America or maybe even from other places, since you know about the...
I don't know how they can fight it in India, but I do know that they have to fight it because governments are trying to do that kind of thing around the world. Sometimes it's at the level of a city where they're trying to disband all of the informal markets and create intermodal transit wholesaling markets where agribusiness refrigerated trailers will bring produce and supermarket trailers will pick it up, and all of it's designed to exclude peasants from supplying that. And so a lot of that started to happen with the supermarketization of food purchasing around the world. And as supermarkets came to dominate urban people's food purchasing, peasants have been progressively excluded from markets that they used to have access to. So, for example, in Latin America, 50 years ago, 70% of all fresh fruits and vegetables bought in cities was bought from peasants in these kind of peasant markets like as described there. And that's changed over 50 years to 70% now being bought in supermarkets. And peasants cannot supply supermarkets because these global supermarket chains like Carrefour and Tesco and others require that the producer turn in large volume on specific dates with specific quality control measures, refrigerated at specific pickup points, cover the freight, cover sometimes the washing and packaging, and that means agribusiness. It's a whole series of barriers that have driven peasants out of it. And now that that's happened by supermarkets, it's happened by city governments reorganizing wholesale distribution networks. Now there are national governments, like in the case of India, that's trying to carry that to the national scale, and it's governments at the service of agribusiness corporations, and it's happening everywhere. It's happening at every scale, and it's a local and global battle everywhere. One of the things, though, I think is taking advantage of the moment where the pandemic has caused a lot of these long distance supply chains of agribusiness and national markets to fail, and to be food shortages, lack of things in supermarket shelves, and a lot of people going back to buying from peasant markets and local markets as a teachable moment, as a pedagogical moment that can help us try to turn around public opinion, because farmer organizations can't just fight that by themselves. They have to fight it in public opinion. They have to talk about why agribusiness food is unhealthy, why it's making us sick, why it doesn't work when there's a pandemic, why peasant and local food is healthier, tastes better, supports the local economy more, etc. Have to build the argument and fight that battle also in public opinion. Over.
Peter, we'll close with one question, and that's from me again, I'm afraid. It has to do with this whole question of land tenure. You didn't talk about community farming or farming on the common lands and so on, but that seems to be a great opportunity for bringing in agroecology. So what does Via Campesina do around, what is its thinking around those issues, for instance?
I can't say that there's a unitary thinking, because the arrangements of communal lands really vary culturally a lot from region to region, within countries, between countries. But there's definitely a general sentiment towards defending the commons and defending collective management. And if I would say, with all of this enormous diversity that is Via Campesina and that are peasant communities around the world, if there were kind of a convergence on some kind of an ideal stereotypical type of rural landscape or rural community, it would be probably something where individual families or collective living units have some of their own land for household production, and where there's also community land where some kind of collective, either animal raising or crop production or tree production takes place, as well as community forest land. And other kinds of community resources that might be rivers or ponds with community collective fishing resources and other things like that. So I would say that if there's any convergence amongst all of this kind of diversity, it's towards something like that, in which there would be collective territory community processes that would promote agroecological farming, these kind of knowledge exchanges, alternative markets, collective marketing, self-provisioning at the community level, education processes at the community level. So there's not like a specific manual on this, but I could say that in general, amongst this divergence, this diversity, there's some kind of a vague convergence towards some kind of an ideal type, more or less along those lines. Over.
So thank you so much. You've been at it for an hour and a half, and you must be tired yourself. So thank you so very much, Peter. It was such a pleasure to have you here. And we were lucky that you're in this part of the world, and you didn't have to struggle with managing time zones and all that.
Well, thank you so much to both of you. I really enjoyed it. Great questions. And thank you so much for inviting me. And thank you, everybody who's connected either in Zoom or on YouTube, for your patience and your interest. And I hope you found it useful. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.